Hi, good evening. My name is Tom Wiscombe. I am chair of the undergraduate department at SCI-Arc. And I have the pleasure of introducing tonight Sekou Cooke, who is an architect and an educator. And I'd like to just give a short introduction and before we bring him on the stage here. And so first of all, he's the newly appointed director of the Master of Urban Design program at UNC Charlotte, and a recipient of the 2021-22 Nazir Jones Hip Hop Fellowship at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University, which I hope he tells us a little bit about. It sounds cool. His practice is Sekou Cooke Studio. So tonight he's going to talk to us about hip hop architecture, I think. You know, it's a social approach, it's an aesthetic approach, and it's really all in. From everything I've seen, it's everything's included from, you know, references to hardcore things like Rodney King beating in the 90s, to rap music, to Compton, to DJ spinning, to even a pimped out 1964 Impala. So it's flashy, but it's also edgy, and it's playful, but it's also pointed. In his full stop introduction to his new monograph, he tells us all that this book is not for you. It is not for architectural academic elites. I like that. It's simultaneously something totally heartfelt, and it's a rhetorical trick of reversal. It puts you on the spot, it shines the light right at you. Should I be reading this? Am I excluded from reading this? Who have I excluded from architecture through my own words and ideas? You sit there and think about it while you're reading it. So, but at the same time, you sense that he wants to let you in to read the book, and he wants to breathe life into architecture. He wants to open the doors and the windows and maybe tear off the roof too. In one of his projects, which I really like, and I hope he shows tonight, which is called, if I'm pronouncing this right, Gridsengrio, or riots, I don't know, for the Chicago Biennale. Yeah, thank you. For the Chicago Biennale, he operates like a DJ, and to quote him, he's chopping things up, repurposing them, remixing them into new, flexible, and responsive compositions. So it's super colorful and playful, and it can be reconfigured, but it's not a toy. It still feels edgy and heavy. It feels like you can slice your hand off on the razor edges of where it was cut, like a bomb went off. So with that, I would like to welcome Sekou Cooke to SCI-Arc, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much for.
Really appreciate the introduction. And I also wanted to thank the students, Eric and Miho, for inviting me, organizing this all, and setting things up. And yeah, I think I will be talking about a few of those projects that Tom referenced. So let's see how this all goes. Yes, so the title of the lecture today is 3D turntables. And I had that title, I changed the title from the original title because I've been rethinking a few things, not editing things out, but really thinking about how to frame conversations around this in different ways. And 3D turntables is actually the name of a research project that I started 7 years ago, or no, sorry, 5 years ago. And now it's reoccurring or being refreshed or remixed here with my work at UNC Charlotte. So I'll talk a little bit about the book in the beginning, and I'll talk a bit about 3D turntables as a setup for a project, and then a couple other projects that I think are related to that. And then at the end, I'll show some of the new iterations of what 3D turntables is becoming, a new direction that I'm taking that I'm not really sure exactly where it's going to go, but I like to show some work in progress every time I give a lecture, so everyone gets something a little bit new. Before I get into this, I did want to say that I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. I wish I could be. The last time, and maybe the only time I was actually ever in the SCI-Arc building, I think was back in 2006. So that was right at the beginning of my teaching career, and I was interviewing for a position, and a faculty position there, and needless to say, I didn't get it, but I think it all turned out okay. Anyway, so starting with hip hop architecture. So this is a theory that hopefully many of you are familiar with right now, something that I've been talking about, lecturing about, writing about for about 7-8 years now. And one of the most powerful books or powerful pieces or essays that I've read about this in my early theoretical work was by Carol Walker. She put together this exhibition back in 2014 at University of Pennsylvania called Roughneck Constructivists. And it was a grouping of visual artists, visual installation artists. But even so, she was in her opening manifesto, she was saying that she's proposing a theory of architecture that was based in this antisocial roughneck hip hop rude boy ethos. But I was really struck by the fact that architecture is what she was basing her theory in. And she also had Craig Wilkins write one of the opening essays. And Craig Wilkins is an architect and actually one of the first people to write extensively about hip hop architecture. So this is the cover of the book. If you haven't seen it as yet, I like to say that as an author, I'm less interested in how many people buy the book than how many people actually read the book, because I want to really have extended conversations about the subjects and theories that I'm proposing in there. So I'll take you through a little bit of the structure of the book. It's broken down into 4 volumes, and each volume has a set of essays that I'm calling tracks or sections. And so the first volume only has 3 tracks: the disclaimer, the manifesto, and the prologue. So the disclaimer, as Tom was mentioning, starts out with the words, "This book is not for you." And there's always a lot of conversation about then who is it for? Then the second paragraph really talks about who it's for. It's for the people who have had their voices kind of squashed or marginalized by the profession or ignored by the profession. But that's not to say that I don't want everyone to read it. I do want everyone to actually read the book, but reading a book, being able to access a book, is different from who the book is actually for, who's its intended recipient, its intended audience. And I end the disclaimer by stating that I'm not a hip hop architect. I'm not even a Black architect. I am an architect. And that's important for me to really distinguish, to not have a qualifier before the fact that I am an architect. So the second volume is where I get into some of the heavier theories. I tackle race and gender quite early on in the volume, and things like nostalgia are taking us back to some earlier hip hop architectural theories that people like Craig Wilkins, Andres Hernandez have written and spoken about. There's the chapter on Gridsengrio that I'll show the project later on that's related to that. And also technology, which is where some of this work that was around 3D turntables found itself, and got expanded in the technology chapter, and then is now being expanded in some of the work that I'm doing now. But here in the authenticity chapter, I start to finally address the topic of defining hip hop architecture. And this is a question that I have avoided quite intentionally for several years until writing the book. And now we're recording. Thank you. So I won't go back to the whole part that wasn't recorded, but I'll just start right here. What is hip hop architecture? This is the bite-sized soundbite version of it, hip hop culture in built form. And then the third volume is where all of the work, most of the work is. This is where we're answering the question, what does hip hop architecture look like? And so it starts out with a chapter on form that describes the process of putting together the hip hop architecture exhibition, which started in New York City and went on to St. Paul a couple of years ago, and now is just now going to open here in Charlotte in a couple of days. On Thursday, it's opening here. And then it takes it breaks down the rest of the work into under image, process, or identity. And then we talk about hip hop urbanism and hip hop space. So it has work like from Olalekan Jafus, who you should be very familiar with his work. He does these beautiful visualizations. Nathan Williams, who did the first hip hop architecture theory thesis project as a B.Arch student at Cornell in 1993, and then work from some of my own students in working in Chicago or in Washington, D.C., and then work from other students like this one, a very recent, one of the most recent hip hop architecture thesis, this from Mauricio Zamora, who did his Master of Architecture at UC Berkeley in 2019. And then some professional work. So from hip hop artists turned architects, like Stefan Malka in Paris, or Delta, a graffiti artist in the Netherlands, or other artists like Theaster Gates, who is a ceramicist, but has made a pretty heavy footprint in the built environment. And then work by others like Sports, this project City Thread in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And the final volume of the book is the speculations, the things that don't quite fit into the hip hop architecture category, but they are tangential movements in architecture that are related to hip hop architecture in one way or another. So, of course, Kanye gets his own chapter, but this chapter is really about whether if a hip hop artist practices or does something in the architecture world, does that make it automatically hip hop architecture? But the other parts are about things like Afrofuturism or informal settlements, like this one in Chile, or what I like to call the neo-postmodernists movement. So this is work from Jennifer Bonner of Mall, whose work you may also be familiar with. So to get into the 3D turntables, I like to start with this idea of hip hop technology. And so this is grounded in many theories, but it starts out with this quote from Harry Allen, who's really talking about the nature of hip hop, what it really does, or its relationship with technology, that it makes it tactile. It makes technology do stuff that it's not supposed to do. And that is quite apparent when you start looking at these original photographs of hip hop parties in the park in summertime, or the original DJ setups with a little light and all of the different components that are put together. And it really positions the DJ as the original hackers of technology. They're always making technology do what it's not supposed to do by first doing the one thing that you're not supposed to do with records, which is put your fingers on them. And that one action changed this passive consumption device into a musical instrument. And then Jay Dilla, of course, is a more recent DJ producer from the mid-90s into the early 2000s. He passed away just less than 10 years ago. But his mastery went beyond the turntable into the drum machine and all these other newer technologies. You can see a laptop in the background, keyboards, and even an old school iPod. So I'm going to show a video that talks a little bit more about Jay Dilla here.
So let's talk about Jay Dilla's drum style first.
He figured out how to humanize the drum machine by avoiding certain things that he could have done to make it more robotic, make it more stiff.
For instance, the MPC has this incredibly useful tool called quantization.
What quantizing does is it takes your performance. Let's say I'm playing my drum pattern. And when I'm playing it, sometimes it's a little ahead, it's a little bit behind.
If your kick drums are off by a little bit, quantization snaps them in place.
And so a lot of producers, they use quantize, not as a crutch, but they just weren't thinking about not using it. And so Dilla was like, yeah, I'm just going to turn this off.
The result is a discography full of incredibly off-kilter drums. This loose drumming style was incredibly influential.
So to expand on that, I include another audio clip here that I talk about in detail in the book. This is a track called Baby, where he's actually taking a sample of the word maybe and making it sound like the word baby, but also it comes in a little early, sometimes a little bit late sometimes. So just listen out for the word baby in the sample, and you'll hear how it keeps changing. So the next kind of starting point for this theory is from Amiri Baraka, some of his writing, and I'm really fascinated by the way he writes. This is directly from how he writes about it. He writes like the way we text now, but he's really talking about this. He's breaking down the typewriter as this machine, and really rethinking it and saying if you were going to be inventing a typewriter, if you're going to invent something that was a word placing machine, then it would go beyond just the fingers. He would want something that you could step or sit or sprawl or hang on, and use to make words express feelings, but elbows, feet, head, behind, and all, and wanted you to get sounds like screams, grunts, taps, itches. So it's really getting much more visceral, much more manual, much more human. And in the end, he says a typewriter is corny. So that leads into the project 3D Turntables, which started in 2017. And it was originally funded by a grant by Autodesk. And it started as a class, and I'm going to show a couple of student works first. And so they were given the assignment to see if they could hack some of these different 3D technologies that we're used to. So the first was a hack of the 3D printer, and this was more of a software hack than a hardware hack. This was telling Cura to print the least amount of support material. And then you get all these wacky, fuzzy, weird things when the objects are printed without support material or without enough support material. Or this one, laser cutter test that is seeking to answer the question, what happens when you print non-planar surfaces, when you laser cut non-planar surfaces? So if you start to fold or cut crushed paper, then you get a whole array of different types of results. There's this beautiful feathering that happens because the lens can't focus. And so that transitioned into some of my own research that following summer, where I took a bunch of these really cheap monoprice printers, and this is what my studio looked like for a few months in the summer. And we were basically hacking the way that this printer, this one specific kind of printer, produced 3D objects. So it has the nozzle that goes in the left to right direction and the bed that goes front to back. And we were literally starting with the scratch, the idea of the scratch. So how can we disrupt those nozzles or the bed as it's coming out? So we start out with a cube primitive, and we always draw all of our results, and then just shifting or interrupting the nozzle as it comes out produces these types of effects, or shifting the bed produces a similar kind of effect. And then we started to test out what happens when we print it without the shell or just without the fill. So you have the shell only, and then you get different results from the same exact software or digital input, the same exact primitive. Then next was the spin. So to actually spin the turntable or spin the printer bed, we had to actually create a new bed and put it on top of the original bed to then turn as the printer printed out. So this is a quick video of what some of that looked like. So we have this other bed on top of it, and we would be printing it until it caught, and then we'd lock it into place so it printed the next layer up. So you start to get these rotational elements like this. And again, it gets pretty messy, but they're pretty fantastic results. And then the third thing we tested was the crossfade. And this is when we had those 3 printers going simultaneously, printing 3 different models, and then we would stop them simultaneously, switch them around, and then continue the print. So the printer would have to find its center once again, and then you start to get results like this, where multiple layers are being printed on top of each other and being mixed together. The next step was to categorize all of that into a matrix of things. And then once going through a few explorations to see how this can get applied in practice in full-scale construction. The one that we first tested was primarily formal. So we started to think about these derelict buildings on the south side of Syracuse and use those as the 3D model primitives, and then run them through the same kind of processes where we print them, we draw them, and then we start to shift and turn and spin them, and even do some other cross-fading and so forth. So these are what some of those models start to look like, again, without the shell, and some with the shell only as well. And then that again goes into a matrix. So we start to understand all the permutations of that. And this is the proposal, as it were, thinking about a building that's slated for demolition, but now is being demolished in a kind of performative way, where it's literally chopped Gordon Matta-Clark style and then rotated or shifted. And then each shifted plane becomes a surface that you can actually put images on that are maybe revealing some of the history of this place, of what it used to be. And so a couple of images of that. I mentioned Gordon Matta-Clark, definitely thinking about some parallels with some of his work in this, but also some work by a couple of photographers, Philippe Dujardin, who does these really fantastic photograph collages, or Xavier Delory, who does similar work. And we can start to think of other ways that this could proliferate or become something different. So I'll talk about 3 different projects that I think this project spawned or started to help us to imagine. The first one is the ADU 1s and 2s. I think this is some of what Tom was referencing in the introduction. This is the one where we're also thinking not just of the 3D turntables projects, but we're thinking about a kind of LA reference. So firstly, and this is part of a project that was initiated by Chris Hawthorne, who is the design director at LADBS. he started this standard plan program for ADUs across LA City, and invited three different East Coast firms to participate. Most of the others invited were all LA-based firms to do a standard plan for ADUs that could be replicated across the city and pre-approved through the LADBS process. So we started with a kind of normative two-floor ADU, thought about the living spaces being striated along the length of it, and then each of those sections would be rotated or shifted along that axis. So you get some results like this. So this is a kind of typical plan of a house, and then the ADU in the backyard here, and then a couple images of what it would look like against the that beautiful LA sunset that you all have out there. And this project is now, we are hoping to break ground on the first one. We have one that's commissioned thus far, and the first one hopefully is going to break ground within the next few weeks. And I may be coming out to LA to go oversee some of that process. The second project is that's related to some of this functioning or working like an urban DJ, is the project that I did for Reconstructions. And the Reconstructions show, as you may know, opened last January of 2021, and ran for a very short 3 months at MOMA. And it was curated and it was part of this series by MOMA, the Architecture and Design Department, on issues in contemporary architecture. So you may be familiar with some of these other books from about a decade ago. This was curated by Sean Anderson and Mabel Wilson. And I was one of 10 Black architects chosen to create newly commissioned works for this show. And each of us was assigned a different city. And this is the introduction to that exhibition.
It has been really hard for brown and Black people to imagine a future in this country.
It's been a real challenge because Black people in America are not given the space to even just be.
In order then to think about possible futures, somehow we have to reimagine ourselves in new places and then find ways to get there.
We're not just interrogating America's history with Blackness, we're interrogating architecture's history with Blackness. So to interrogate architecture's history with Blackness, I started in Syracuse because it's the city that I'd been in and been studying for about 8 or 9 years. And looking specifically at the 15th Ward in Syracuse. And it's a quintessential American story of placement and displacement of Black bodies within cities. So the 15th Ward was a really thriving Black community, thriving Black businesses. And then by the 1960s or late 1950s, early 1960s, this is what it looked like. A real a victim, if you will, of urban renewal and urban renewal policies. And so the area that I was primarily interested in was this area, which is just to the west of the university, of the Syracuse University. On the right-hand side, you're seeing the medical universities on that hill. On the top left is the Civic Center, which really was the heart of the 15th Ward. And then in the foreground is these public housing projects, which were also built in the 1930s and 40s that were that had removed a whole bunch of housing that was deemed as slum housing. That was an extension of the 15th Ward. And then you can see the highway I-81 actually cuts right through the middle of that housing project. So there's all these various layers of construction and destruction happening over and over again in this area. Blueprint 15 is this organization that is in charge of now thinking about all this land around what used to be the 15th Ward, and rethinking it. It's owned now by Syracuse Housing Authority. They own a lot of that land. The elevated viaduct of I-81 is now confirmed that it's going to be coming down. So they're trying to rethink that whole area. So, however, when they've hired this company called PurposeBuilt Communities, this development company, and they've talked about, this is a quote from the Blueprint 15 website, that they're really impressed and want to model the successes of Atlanta's East Lake community. But when you actually look more closely at Atlanta's East Lake and some other purpose-built communities projects, only about 20% of the people who get displaced from their housing ever return. And they're seeing 25% as some magical number of success. But again, people can't ever come back to a home that got destroyed and repurposed and got turned from low income housing into mixed income housing. And so I had a couple, I grounded some of the work that I was doing in a couple of these quotes, as I like to do. This one from Catherine McKittrick, who's talking about the history of Black people in this country is a history of constantly being placed and displaced. And then this other one from The Wire, one of my favorite shows. This is from season 3, episode 1, where they're tearing down the public housing that they used to live in. And, you know, they're going to tear this down. They're going to build some other shit, but, you know, they don't really give a fuck about people, is the sentiment that's at the center of this quote. So then we started out trying to find all these different traces of history that used to be there on this site. You can see I-81 going right through the middle of the housing projects here. And we were lucky enough to find some of these beautiful old original drawings of Pioneer Homes, the primary low-income housing project that was built in 1938. And if you look closer at these drawings, you start to see dotted in were the individual houses that were removed in order to build this project. And again, you can see these beautiful little dotted lines of removal. And then this other housing project, McKinney Manor, is interesting because this was built in the 1990s or early 2000s and replaced another low-income housing project that was there before, and then there was housing before that. So there's all these other layers of removal that have happened beforehand. And I called this project Outchea, and this is a couple stills from one of the videos called Outchea by Ace Hood, and it kind of embodies the attitude of the project itself, which is about taking over public space, residential space, and kind of refusing to be removed again. So I'll walk you through some drawings that were developed for the project. I overlapped and intersected multiple layers of all of the historical layers of this project, from the houses that were there before to the housing that came in afterwards, and where that intersected, you see these orange boxes, and then the white boxes are a kind of proposed, assumed, really bad development project that will happen there as a low-income housing project based on some of the projects that Purpose-Built Communities has done in the past and the proposed density for this project. So it's a almost intentionally not designed white box of housing. And then what we do is then we subtract out some of those intersections from that housing. And then you get some of these really fantastic three-dimensional intersections. And then the ground itself is also marking and tracing the history of all the layers that have been forgotten. And then when we look at the plans of the buildings, these plans are also kind of not designed. They're collaged in from other floor plans that were found from purpose-built from Atlanta's East Lake, actually, and then put together with basic vertical circulation and egress. And then the last few collages are sections and quotes and images that kind of round out the attitude of the project itself. And then the last layer, once these were developed and printed, the last layer was to actually screen print on by hand some of the traces of those old drawings that we had uncovered. And this is how these were displayed in the show itself. And as a companion to that, there are 3 larger renderings of what that space was going to look like. Again, this dumb, banal, almost ghost-like new development project, but then it's subtracted from that is all the remnants or the traces of all the housing that used to be there. And then here's a kind of sectional elevation through the whole project. And then the last piece of that was displayed was this model that was based on thinking through this idea of actually chopping and cutting and intersecting planes or surfaces. So I actually used this is my back stoop from the house that I used to own in Syracuse that I just sold last year. And we concrete stoop, precast concrete stoop, and chopped it ourselves right in place, and then transported that to our shop, and then built this base for it, which is a series of plywood layers that also have these subtractions coming out of it at this in-between scale. And then there's these other elements at the smaller scale of the model that are, kind of model scale really, that are 3D printed and laser cut and then assembled together. And the last piece of the puzzle was this little chunk of concrete that was, again, at the middle scale, representing that middle scale intersection. And this is how it started to look when it all came together. This really massive, large 800-pound thing that now is going to get re-exhibited at the Everson Museum in April of this year in Syracuse, New York. And this is what it all looked like in the gallery at MOMA. Photographs of people coming up to it and actually wanted to touch it, sit on it, step on it, which made the security guards go a little bit nuts, but I had a couple conversations with them. So the last project that I'll discuss here is Gridsengrio by special request. And this is a project that was done last fall for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. David Brown is the curator of the Biennial, called it Available City. And that's based on the idea that if you look at all of the empty lots in Chicago, across the city, mostly concentrated around the west side and the south side, so the poorest, blackest neighborhoods. If you put those all together, they'll be the size of the average mid-size American city. So there's this entire a city that's available to us. And so I started this idea for my intervention, started with the idea of the grid. So thinking about the Chicago grid, and then referencing back the chapter I had just written in the book called Gridsengrio. So I'm going to play another audio track here that is talking about the grid. This is Mos Def talking about the grid in a very provocative way. So there, Most Def is listing all these different types of spaces, acres of tombstones, cell block tiers, tenement row houses. These are all places that where the Black body has encountered the grid. And each time the Black body has encountered the grid in the Western Hemisphere, it's been a really oppressive, controlling, quite violent force, even though we start to think about the grid in architecture as this neutral force. And I write about this extensively in that chapter in the book. But the first confrontation with the grid is, of course, with the slave ship. So in the galleys of the slave ship, it's all about this efficiency, right? So the grid is this efficient, very rational organizational tool, but of course it's been quite traumatic for the Black body in this continent. And then the griot is this West African figure who's a storyteller, an entertainer, sometimes a healer, but always a keeper of the histories and traditions of a people. And so the griot is always compared to the DJ in hip hop culture, because the hip hop DJ, as Adam J. Banks writes in his book Digital Griot, performs a similar function. They are the keepers of these histories, not just oral histories, but cultural histories, musical histories. They're always digging through crates to find references that people have forgotten about or didn't know about. So they're really important. They're like the modern day griot in our culture. And then for the projects, David Brown paired me with YMen, Young Men's Educational Network. It's a local nonprofit organization in Chicago that has had some empty lots that they owned and controlled. And he was very adamant about architects working with local community organizations for these installations. So this is the lot that we were assigned. So Wyman owns that corner lot where there's that red shipping container already on there. And then they own the other two lots below that where our project was situated. And right now they have this large red box that they call the bike box, where they store bicycles. People donate bicycles, they repair bicycles, they teach people how to fix bicycles, and they loan them out to anyone who wants them. Then there's another shipping container for additional tool storage. And then there's an area for raised planter beds. So we really wanted to amplify some of the things that were already there. We also had this beautiful color palette that was given to us. So this was a color palette that was developed by some graphic designers at SAIC to actually paint the outside of the bike box, but they only ended up using the red and the green, I think, along with the black. So we wanted to use the rest of this color palette in our project. And then the grid is, you don't have to look too far to find grid references in Chicago, not just the ubiquitous city grid, but this is right across the lot. This is an old building that's a car wash now. And it's just this beautiful layered textures of gridded surfaces. And of course, the shipping container itself is this perfect 8x8 grid that has all these embedded grids, and it's 40 feet long. So that's 8 times 5. So we start out with that grid with the 40-foot shipping container, kind of duplicating the container that was already there, and then chop it up in these variegated ways like a DJ. Open it up, expand it to allow room to move through, and then take the tops off of some of these sections and shift it to suggest different areas of occupation. Plywood panels are put in to allow each of these pieces to function in the way that they would for the program that was worked on with YMen for their uses and amplified some of the things they had going on already. And then these are all anchored to a concrete platform that reinforced that 8-foot by 8-foot grid as well. And so this is the whole collection of things, all of the program laid out. So there is additional bike storage in the red box. There's bench seating and tables. There's more planter beds that are raised. There's a performance area and also some spaces, some small kiosks for informal retail operations. The cutting of the container was relative. The fabricator, the drawings, they drew the lines right on the container and just cut it and moved it around with their jacks and what do you call that thing? You know what it's called. I can't think of it right now. I forgot to mention that it's way later for me here on the East Coast, so I might not be as articulate as I usually am. Anyway, so they were able to chop up the container and place it on the concrete beds that was already there. And luckily they were able to just place it exactly where it was supposed to be. Forklift is the word that I was looking for. So this is the whole project in place. And you can see in the background there, that's another project, called Soil Lab, that was heavily funded by the Danish consulate, Danish embassy. And then this was one of the most exciting parts of this project, that in order to finish off the project, we enlisted the help of some of the participants of Y-Men. So these are the young men and women who are part of the program, who are paid for 3 days to help to paint and finish the assembly of the whole project. And most of them hadn't painted before, so they had to get a few painting lessons. But they did a great job of participating and doing all the work for the 3 days to paint all the plywood panels and paint all the insides of the shipping container to get us closer to that result. Out to Chicago to help assemble everything. This is what it all looks like when it was finally painted. And even though Tom thinks that it could slice people's hands off, all of those edges were burnished and cleaned up. And luckily, we had a lot of this soil on hand the last day of installation. So the truck pulled up, and all of a sudden, all this soil was being placed in the planter beds. We also got some extra base soil from Soil Lab, some of their leftover soil. And then there were some plants and flowers that are planted the same day. And so these are some photographs of the piece as it is when it's finished. I like this picture because the arrows on the side kind of suggest that shifting. You can see the bike box with its title on it right now. This is opening day. Soil Lab is also open on the left. This is me talking to the press. And this is actually the Danish ambassador and her staff taking pictures in front of our project and not in front of the Soil Lab. And this is one of their delegation as well, that opening day. And then a few more images that I seem to like more than my staff. This is just pictures I like of just show color and texture of the piece. So I'll end by bringing it back to the 3D turntables. And this is what I call the remix. This is a new version that I'm taking up of the original investigation. I'm not exactly sure where it's going, but I have the luxury of time and resources that I can actually buy a real $4,000 3D printer instead of a $200 3D printer. But this one, of course, is more of a closed system, doesn't allow hacking as easily. Except we noticed that these little tabs, these little metal tabs, were what was holding the print bed down. So it was actually a much easier hack. So all we did was just open those clips And then now we could actually move the bed however and whenever we want. And this is part of a larger series of ideas that we're thinking about for using manual, humanized DJ inputs, physical analog inputs, and getting them digitally translated into the computer to then have 3 different types of outputs, maybe a live moving of an active space through hydraulics, or a digital, a live transformation of digital environments in the 3D digital world, or actually affecting 3D fabrication tools like the 3D printer or a robot arm. And so we started out just replicating some of the results that we got from the first study. So just shifting the bed in orthographic axes. But now we have 2 nozzles. So now we have a support material, and we also play around with what happens with that support material and shifting it around, or 2 things kind of mixing into each other. And then this is where the last bit of the research is taking a new direction, where we start with this DJ set, and we start to analyze all the movements of the actual DJ's hands. So here we're primarily looking at the rotation of the turntables and the manipulation of the crossfader. And so each of these, we give an index of what it does, and then there's a corresponding movement of the print bed. And then, of course, I like these matrices. So this is a diagram of all of the different sections. So we break the whole 60-second clip up into 1 second, 1 second increments, and then we have a kind of measurement or a metric that each second of video would equal 3 layers of printing. So now we can print this tall column and then shift and manipulate the bed to align with what's happening in the DJ video. So it's a kind of precursor to having a live DJ actually do this, but here's a video of us kind of compressing and colliding those 2 worlds together.
Stand back, watch the bomb drop. All the competition that try to compete. Stand back, watch the bomb drop. All the competition that try to compete. Stand back, watch the bomb drop. You think I'm losing? Picture that. You want flavor, I'm the man to call on. The suckers wanna battle, bring them all on. So step up if you wanna get hurt. Suckers wanna battle, bring them all on. So step up if you wanna get hurt. Suckers wanna battle, bring them all on. So step up if you suckers wanna battle. So step up if you suckers wanna battle. So step up if you suckers wanna battle. Here we go again. So step up, suckers, if you want a battle. So step up, suckers, if you want a battle. So step up, suckers, if you want a battle. So step up, suckers.
Thank you. That's all I got.
That was great, Sekou. Thank you so much. I love the 3D printers. If only we could get them to move faster, you know?
Yeah. That was obviously a compressed video.
Yeah, no, but it's brilliant. It's brilliant. Very cool. Well, anyway, thank you so much for your lecture, and we are going to adjourn now to a Q&A session. So, so I'll see you over there.
Sounds great. I'll see you there.
Thank you.